check, check. Alrighty.
I know where other judges come to check out the flower and stuff.
Alrighty, you guys, I'm going to get started here. It's cool seeing all the competitors checking out the flower. So we've got the Aloha Cup going on at the same time as Hawaii Cannabis Expo. So we actually have on the side of the room here all the entrants for this competition. I actually have sun-grown and indoor, so there's no mixed light or light depth. So everyone's checking that out over there. So I'll kick off. What my presentation is about is optimizing your crop post-harvest from cure to consumption. Been a focus in my career for some time now, being an outdoor grower full term. So something that definitely hits close to home, especially being a grower. You know, growing's only half the battle. It's what you do post-harvest, which obviously, like some of these competitors over here know, like it's one thing to properly grow the flower, breed the flower, and all the rest of it. But it's another, obviously, to properly dry it, properly trim it, properly cure it, store it, etc. So kind of first to kick off, grew up in NorCal, kind of cool. Got a friend Reggie here from up on the hill as well, from Canada Country. Shout out to Canada Country, put out absolute fire. Popped my first seed when I was 13, so I've been doing it for a little while. I will admit I'm full-term outdoor, so on my company's team, I'm one of the few. Most of my colleagues are indoor or at most mixed light, so I do full-term outdoor organic. I'm one of those old heads from NorCal. I segued from the traditional market to the licensed market years ago. So interesting enough, even having grown up in NorCal, cut my teeth out in Colorado on the legal side, first with a company called the Cannabist, and then moved on to be head of global media for a tech company called WeedMaps, and then scaled up companies like Bovida, GreenBroz, Green Flower, and now Grow Bags. Seem to like companies that start with the letter G. So kind of first is understanding the plant life cycle. That's definitely vital. Obviously respecting the plant, no matter, again, if you're God growing, as I like to call it, which is indoor, or if you're Mother Nature growing, which I prefer, which is outdoor. And obviously how that life cycle doesn't end when the plant is chopped. An example that I use is, cutting off the head of the queen. Yes, the queen passes away, but cutting off the base of a plant, that doesn't mean the plant just instantaneously dies. It naturally tries to reproduce and regenerate. So we'll get into that. Also, the plant physiology matters. So this is something obviously impacts post-harvest treatment and packaging decisions. So we'll get into that. And then following the data is important. So there's some real, I don't know, I call ourselves connoisseurs, but some people use the term plant geeks. Obviously, you can see some competitors up here. They're hardcore plant geeks wanting to see what other people's flowers smelling like, looking like. Obviously, hopefully they'll get to a point where they can taste it and get the experiential, the chemo type as well. But following the data is important. That's one thing that all of us as growers, whether we admit it or not, everything's a hypothesis. Am I going to use salts or not, artificial newts not, am I going to use just natural organic soil, am I going to use synthetics? All these things go into the minds of all these growers, and that's why it's so fun. When Nick's like, can I have all the flower come out during your speaking? I'm like, I wouldn't have it any other way, man. It feels like being back home. But these guys are checking out all those things, right? We judge things by the way they feel, by the way they smell, by the way they look, and ultimately by the way they taste and the experiential. So first, getting into the two-part phase post-harvest, it's kind of interesting. So I've been traveling internationally for the plant for about 12 years now, and again, first for WeedMaps and then for other companies in the industry, taking them global. But it's interesting how drying and curing is very different in different markets. For anyone that's been to the Netherlands, they don't have a legal program per se. They've always worked in the gray area, so it's tolerated once it crosses the threshold of a coffee shop. So that determines the quality of the end product. So the growers are underground growers or attic growers, or they're getting stuff that's being brought in from Spain, more recently from Canada, always from California. You can always find California flower on any menu in Spain or in the Netherlands. But the thing is, that flower is typically not cured or fractionally cured. And that's because of the chain of custody, right? It's illegal. I'll just kind of pick on Nick. He's a friend in the front row here. So Nick's a grower. So Nick will grow that flower. I'm a courier or a distributor in our legal markets. So I'm the courier. I'll transport it. What he's doing is illegal in the Netherlands. What I'm doing is illegal in the Netherlands. It's only tolerated and not, obviously, a crime once it gets across the threshold. So, of course, we don't want to give the time to excessively dry or cure because that increases the risk of Nick or I, obviously, being incarcerated or minimum fine. So it is really important that you properly cure. There's other places where it's a challenge based on the geographics. So you have high desert, low desert markets like Nevada, Arizona, California, Colorado, and you think you're free because it's so dry. There's still aspergillus and other things as growers we have to be comprehensive of. But then you have the inverse. And so when I was just speaking in Niagara Falls, quite an extreme temperate difference from here a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about some of the challenges they have, but I was pointing out the challenges that Hawaiians have, that folks growing in Thailand or Jamaica that have really high humidity climates where, Mother Nature oftentimes is kind of taking from us, taking the terpenes as they off-gas, the cannabinoid quality going down as it gets oxidized. Here, you all actually have an excessive amount of Mother Nature giving, which is, again, the moisture. And that's one thing that you have to balance the most. So really drying, for those that are newer to it, that's removing the free and some bound water that exists within the biomass. This is very important because when you take the plant off its life force, it's literally at 90% plus humidity. So it's very similar to a head of lettuce or celery or other agricultural goods. Proper drying is vital, not just for preventing microbial growth. Does anyone know the magic number when microbials pop off on a plant? It's a certain percentage of relative humidity. So 65% is that threshold. That's why tobacco, not that I'm a fan of it, but for cigar smokers, they'll sometimes store their cigar sticks in as high as like 82, 85% relative humidity. They can do that because they have something that will naturally keep the microbials at bay, and that's nicotine. Nicotine is, think of it as like a pesticide for nothing to grow on that plant matter once it's dead. Cannabis doesn't have that luxury. So we have to make sure that we keep the right amount of moisture content dissipated from the plant and still bound within the plant to maintain that quality. That's where curing really comes into play. It's a complex and it's not a completely understood process. So again, you have some extremes. You have certain people that will cure just a nominal amount. So a good example of that would be, again, the Netherlands, where they don't spend too much time to cure, or the Spanish market, where they don't have too much time to cure. Opposite, you go to Italy, and that's where I learned, even before the technology at my company does, the Italians taught me about not just curing, but aging your bud, which is kind of an interesting thing. So with curing, again, you're allowing the sugars to mature, you're allowing the terpenes and cannabinoids to express themselves, but with aging, you're allowing that to actually ferment and get the best quality and potency out of that product. So the way the Italians framed it out to me, and they said, well, grapes have terpenes, and you see what we go through as far as the curing and aging process of those, so why would it not apply to flower? So there is a lot that's happening with the residual enzymatic process during that. Little bit of fermentation, again, as the sugars continue to evolve. Yeah, definitely. I know it's kind of, so really making sure that you properly do the cure. One of the most important, there's several elements that contribute, but making sure that you have, again, the right amount of relative humidity in the environment within what you're curing. So rather it be a glass jar, like you see jars up here, or turkey bag, or our bags, or totes. You really want to make sure that you're retaining the right amount of moisture in that environment. So it's very vital for you to make sure that you're maintaining that. The other is exposure to light. You guys know that. This is, if anyone's ever dated someone that wanted to hang and dry their roses, obviously you put it in a very high, low humidity place to dry it. You don't want to do that with these kind of flowers. You want to make sure that you keep it out of direct sunlight, that you keep it in a cool environment that, again, has some sort of at least minimum airflow during the dry process, but obviously just that nice, cool, dark place during the cure process. So again, you'll see in some of the tests that we've done, and this is just specific to utilizing terp block for curing, but we've actually seen the maximum percentage of both terpenes and cannabinoids occurring at the 8-week curing process phase. So a lot only cure for 2 weeks, some cure for 4 weeks. Believe it or not, curing for up to 8 weeks, you're going to see the optimal percentage of terpenes and cannabinoids. And again, that's what I like about the last panel. There's too much of an emphasis being put on THC, and we'll kind of get into that just now. So there's obviously complex elements, again, that these guys are looking for. Some people are more attracted to gas. Some people are more attracted to that lighter hazy, some more the skunky, some of the fruity. For those that have been in the industry or those that have been following the trends of cannabis, we went through a really heavy dessert and cake and ice cream phase. So wedding cake, ice cream cake, gelato, Skittles, runts, all those really fruity flavors. We've been seeing those over the last several years in more predominant markets for genetics, which is Northern California, Spain, the Netherlands. So we're definitely seeing a shift away from that finally, back to more of like the sours, the gases. And again, I'm really curious to see what wins here, because there's a great mixture of all different types of flavors being represented. But the one thing to point out is in the early days of legalization, especially back in the teens, everyone was always talking about the entourage effect, which that's great, that's fine. But really what true connoisseurs are looking for, and again, I kind of call out Reggie in the crowd, because going up to his farm, we just filmed a documentary up on his farm last fall. And what Reggie and his team does is really looks to get the best profile out of that plant. And it's not leading with THC. It's what's the terpene diversity. And that's a conversation that guys like he and I have, is what's your favorite terpenes? Not what's your favorite loudness on THC, not 34. And you guys know this, not to state the obvious. Someone's claiming they have 40% THC. You're talking about 40% of overall, that being one specific element, right? And so we need to look at it from a big picture. It's a concert effect and not an entourage effect. So making sure, if it's a plant that more commonly expresses, maybe it's not just THC, but CBG, CBD, CBN, some of the other major and minor cannabinoids, but the terpene profiles. Again, I'm kind of picking on Reggie because he's right here, but like Canada Country, the way that they kind of judge their certain cultivars is what terpenes and what terpene profiles and percentages exist in those cultivars. So for me, I know I'm more of a myrcene, pinene, limonene. That's just what I'm attracted to for terpenes. I can look at his chart and go, oh, this is the flower for me, because I like the experiential based on interacting with those terpenes. But again, really keeping in mind, it's a concert effect. So if you are growing, rather be for yourself, from a medical standpoint, the traditional market, the legal market, just keep in mind that there are people out there that want that diversity. They aren't looking just for the loud. And that is a problem with the legal industry, is we've been catering to the quintessential stoner. Now, all of us are consumers. I'm a regular consumer. Nick's a regular. There's people in this room that are regular consumers, but we're functioning, successful businessmen that happen to consume something that's healthy for us, if recreational, versus something that's poison for us, like alcohol. Or we look at this as a medical alternative, right? For me, CBG is anti-inflammatory. I don't take Advil anymore. CBD helps with pain. I don't take Tylenol anymore. CBN helps with sleep. I don't take Sominex anymore, right? So there's some of us that look at it from a medical and or therapeutic standpoint, and those are the people that you want to tap into, especially in a medical market like Hawaii. This is a medical market first. Love for it to be adult use ultimately. I think it's a good opportunity in this market, but respect the fact that it's medical now. So being cognizant of these things is important. And they're all volatile organic compounds. So another thing to keep in mind, these guys are opening these jars, taking the little seals off and smelling them. Every time you're smelling them, you're smelling the off-gassing of the terpenes, because they're so volatile. Once they hit 70 degrees or about room temperature, they start off-gassing. So you're actually smelling the genie leave the bottle. The problem is you can't put her back in, right? So what these guys are smelling is something that otherwise they would be smoking. So making sure you sequester these elements and keep them in a safely contained space is definitely an important factor. Now, another thing you get into, this is something, again, this is geeking out on the post-harvest side. I know a lot of people put a lot of time and energy on the growing. I am one that literally goes down March, pulls out in October. So I'm spending months with that plant, right? But again, growing's only half the battle. How you treat the plant post-harvest is just as pivotal to maintain the quality, the consistency, and the potency of that plant matter. So it's really important, like I was saying before, being mindful of the water. So there's two different types of water measurements. There's free water, free available water, so that's your water activity, and your relative humidity. So anyone who lives here on the islands, you guys know relative humidity. Back home, we don't pay as much attention to it. Mine's around 40%, 50%. Doesn't really bother me. Bound water, this is important because this is what's inside the biomass. So this is what's being contained inside that plant matter. So the bound water, the reference of a sponge is, if you've ever wrung out a sponge and it still feels a little wet, you've probably displaced some of that water on the outside of that sponge. But there's bound water that's in the middle of that sponge, natural or synthetic, that would take a lot more to get out. Oftentimes you just set the sponge on top of your counter and it eventually dries. So that's something to keep in mind with cannabis. Cannabis is essentially like a sponge. So there's going to be free water. All of these jars, if I were to get a hygrometer right now, in a little hygrometer, it'd have to be tiny for these jars. If I were to put a hygrometer in those jars, probably most of this bud is anywhere between 55 and 65% relative humidity. So again, that's the amount of moisture that's in that environment that's not bound. Again, moisture content, if you're a grower or if you're studying growing and you're wanting to learn more about moisture, you'll learn about moisture content. That's the bound water that's inside the bud. So that's an important thing to be mindful of as well. Again, just in drying and curing. Potency and quality is more than just THC. So I talked about that, but the last thing you should be going after is THC numbers. It's really tough. But again, Fred and I were just talking about this yesterday. You know, for those of us old heads, like if you recall, no matter if you grew up with Northern Lights or you know, Maui Wowie or Pineapple Express, Cat Piss, whatever local cultivar you always love, the hazes, right? You guys have some phenomenal hazes out here. You notice you never purchased that on the traditional market by THC level. You purchased it based on what it looked like, what it felt like, what it smelled like, what it tasted like, what the experience was, and if it worked with your endocannabinoid system. So this is one thing that a lot of us are trying to preach is, again, step away from the THC. Some of the most popular cultivars, one that's still being smoked by most of the old heads on the hill up in the triangle that comes to mind is Forbidden Fruit. Forbidden Fruit, phenomenal cultivar, really great expression, fairly easy to grow compared to some cultivars. But the nice thing about Forbidden Fruit is the median percentage for THC is like 16%. But the median percentage for terpenes is about 5%. So again, if you look at it as cannabinoids are the engine of the high, terpenes are the steering wheel, right? So, and again, I'll point out the fact of being a Gen Xer. I have a lot of friends, I just turned 50, I have a lot of friends that are in the late 40s, early 50s. Lance, I'm getting tired of drinking. I wake up, I drink water, I go to the bathroom, I drink water, I go to the bathroom, I wake up with a headache, 4 hours of fun, 8 hours of pain. I don't want to do alcohol anymore. I've realized it's poison. I've grown up, right? Especially for my guy friends, because guys, arrested development is a problem. So these people go out and they go, okay, I'm going to try some cannabis. I'm going to go out to my local dispensary. What's the most convenient, discreet way for me to consume? Could anyone guess? It's a really popular way. If you go to the clubs, you see people ripping them all day. The vape pen, right? Super. If you just need a high on the fly, as I like to call it, you grab your vape pen, right? I've got, not point out who I go from, I'll keep it covered, but here's one right here in my hand, right? So you have it right at your fingertips, super convenient. But the one thing that is a bit of an issue is for people who haven't traditionally consumed, they get back into consuming, they start with oils. A lot of times those oils are isolates, right? They're not broad spectrum, let alone full spectrum. So I have friends who are reaching out to me and they're like, dude, I want to switch over to something healthier. But the problem is I go from being sober to like high and just cloudy, like no direction, no real experiential, just high. Like I'm just like looped and sitting there like, lazy log, bumping a log. The reason being is because a lot of times during that process, and this is why live rosin has become so popular in so many markets, right? You're using Mother Nature to squeeze out the best. But when people are doing CO2 or BHO or even ethanol-based extraction, they're stripping out some of the elements. So another metaphor I like to use is it's like breaking a glass table and trying to reassemble it. It's never going to be the same. So for people who are getting back into consuming, to your point, man, I'm an edibles judge. I'm an edibles fan. I think edibles are convenient. I think you can start really low and go slow. I'm a big advocate of microdosing, 1-2 milligrams, not 10 milligrams. The average dosage in almost every legal market is 10 milligrams in the US. That's like 2 or 3 shots of vodka for someone who's never consumed cannabis before. So for those that are new in the room to consumption, I agree, like edibles, you can meter, you can manage. Now there's more variables. The uptake is a lower percentage, but there are more variables that come into play. Have you eaten, yes or no? How's your metabolism work? What's your weight, your body mass index, etc. But it's a little bit more controlled. And smoking's become faux pas, right? Not in Europe, not in Asia. It's still kind of trendy there. But at least in the US, it's become kind of taboo to smoke, even though consuming by incineration is the highest uptake rate. So you actually absorb about 40% of those cannabinoids and terpenes when you smoke. But it's not convenient, and then again, a lot of people think it's not healthy. So just something to keep in mind, but it's not all about the THC numbers. It's about, and something that the last panel talked about, knowing your endocannabinoid system and finding what works for you, right? So what works for you based on if you have problems with chronic pain, your ankles and knees like me, like I have a Harlequin cross that we came across with a company I was working with years ago. And it's a GDP cross with Harlequin, so it has a nice balance of heady body. So I get a little bit of that experiential, but for me, the pain just like within a minute or two of consuming just dissipates. So find what works for you. And I'll get into questions too. So one thing I'm going to touch on really quick, because this is something, and I'm not about infomercial. I've always lead with education, advocate, cancer survivor, now 23 years this September. So that's my background. I'm getting into it. Thank you guys. So people do come by though and they ask, well, what do you do? What's your best practice? So what I do is utilize modified atmospheric packaging. So that's essentially what our technology does. The only reason I am bringing it up here, because again, you all are constantly fighting humidity. It's insane. Like this is one of those places I came when I did work with Bovida, when I was scaling them out. I came out here in 2017. And there's a guy, it's like, I've been using this same humidity pack for the last 2 years. Is there something wrong? And I'm like, no, there's nothing wrong, but you're in such a high humidity environment that it's essentially just acting like a desiccant pack and taking out any excessive moisture. It's not putting anything back in because you have too much moisture. So using something that's more of a modified atmospheric packaging solution, so it's sealed and it's contained, is probably the best bet for this kind of market. Because again, if you're using a traditional for curing or for storing type of vessel, every time you open it, you're actually not worrying about losing moisture, you're worrying about gaining moisture. And that's what's insane. When stuff is too wet, normally you open the bag and set it on the table, and okay, it'll dry enough for me to grind it, it'll dry enough for me to smoke it, consume it. but definitely is something that's a little bit of a handicap in markets that are high humidity because you don't want that excessive moisture. You'll have the microbials and eventually mold pop off. So gas exchange is another thing I'm going to get into. So this is what is happening. There is off-gassing that occurs during drying, but I'm going to talk a little bit more of the off-gassing during curing. So again, a lot of people, it's the chlorophylls, it's these things that you don't want. It's also a little bit of the plant trying to regenerate too. So it's off-gassing what it normally puts in, and obviously putting out a lot less of what it'd normally be putting out, which would be oxygen. So taking advantage of that gas exchange, and again, a few of the cannabinoids that we talked about before, like CBN, cannabinol, I call that the ghost cannabinoid. It's essentially an oxidized version of THC. So this plant, even if you left it sitting out for a year, obviously is still working its magic and putting out something really cool. There you go. There you go. Nice, man. And that's the easiest and least expensive way. Some guys manipulate it with short path, right? With you can distill and oxidize in distillation, but like to your point, I do too. Put it in a garbage bag. Yeah. Yeah, I do the same thing, man. That's spot on. That's cool. Yeah, and you work with what you have. Again, I mean, it's interesting how we saw this evolution, especially back in the 2010s, where again CO2 extraction was coming in full, and these machines, this equipment, you guys, that these companies were spending tens of thousands of dollars. And then you realize that the quality, the consistency, and the potency of people that were doing things like you're doing, where they're just naturally letting it oxidize, or they're just using heat and pressure for extraction versus any sort of chemical for extraction. Like, these are things that sometimes they evolve in a good way if you're scaling up. But if you're a home grower or a caregiver, you have that time and energy and limited resources. A lot of the traditional methods work just as well, honestly, if not better. That's where a lot of the extractions and on the distillate side, like tinctures and such, you know, even hydrosols. That's, I don't know if you guys, not to go on a tangent, if you're just looking to capture more terpenes and flavonoids, like doing a hydrosol with some of your trim is kind of cool too. So something to look into. So I won't get into all this, but this is just what I was talking about before. Like, we love geeking out and measuring things. So looking at different things like jars versus like what we do, or excuse me, or MetPet, or utilizing a humidity pack. These are the things that we look into because we're home growers. We want to see how we can maintain that ideal state, which is right here, really between 55 and 60% humidity. If you're a little bit higher, that's fine. Excuse me, but in a market like this, I would not allow the percentage of humidity to get too high. Because again, you leave it out, you leave it unchecked, and you're going to get into that danger zone, and that's when all of a sudden you have powdery mildews and such pop off. So again, we kind of talked about cannabinoids and terpenes. Again, this is just stuff that we geek out. I'm not going to get into infomercial, but we really geek out on like, what are the total cannabinoids? What can we do to make sure to retain as many cannabinoids as possible, and to be able to retain as many terpenes as possible? Because those are the two things that create that true concert effect. And then the chlorophyll. So again, kind of looking at what your chlorophyll is doing, looking at your Brix measurements, obviously the terpene and cannabinoid count. We really geek out because we want to know what's happening, because a lot of this plant is an enigma even to this day. You go to places like Tel Aviv, Israel, where they have the University for Cannabis and Cancer Study. And they're finding that certain cultivar-specific combinations are able to eradicate cancer cells. But even they're still trying to figure out what they can do to optimize that to be as efficient as possible. So in many instances, again, it's still quite an enigma. So again, passive, simple, purposeful tech, active, complex, or adaptive tech, growing, drying, curing, final packing to market, more of like a retail strategy if you're a reseller. Growing, drying, curing, and final packaging all in one. It's just a matter of, again, that chain of custody, maintaining the quality, consistency, and potency. Mitigating touch points. That's something that we're trying to work with certain groups, where finding when you have excessive touch points, there's that opportunity for contamination. So I'll go on a quick tangent here. When Colorado legalized, they did deli style. Anyone familiar with that term? So deli style purchasing is you go in, and it's kind of like this. This is a good example. So you'd normally have at a dispensary a bunch of jars, large jars, and I'd say, oh, I want to try the Trainwreck cross with Susie Q in this front. And so the bud tender, or I like to be PC, cannabis consultants, what I call them, cannabis consultant will grab the jar, take it out, open it up, let you smell it. That's something they're still doing in markets like Oregon. We're trying to get them to go into a pre-packed market because the opportunities for contamination. And again, it's us looking at from a medical stance versus a recreational stance. Like people who depend on this medicine, some of them have weakened immune systems, have comparable or compromised immune systems. So making sure that that chain of custody and maintaining the quality, consistency, potency, and safety of that finished plant is very important. So trying to make sure to streamline and work with our partners to be able to put out the best possible product while being the safest possible product as well. I know I'm kind of blasting through these. So some of the different things we've done with integration with our technology, but the point being is, again, rather you're a home grower, a grower that's essentially going to maybe transition into being, an adult use or rec producer, maybe you're on the medical side, caregiver side, making sure you put as much time and energy in the post-harvest as you do in the growing process will assure that you put out a quality product. That's one thing that, again, too many people are rushing it. Even your own home grows. So for those that are venturing into that space, give yourself enough space to work with on the post-harvest side. That's when touring operations, some of the biggest operations in the world, one of them that's a 9-acre Kobe greenhouse that's 20 minutes from my place in SoCal, these guys have massive square footage for production, but then their post-production is like a stamp in the grand scheme of things. Make sure you give yourself enough space to dry, enough space to trim, enough space to cure. Make sure that you're maintaining those environments. A lot of those environments can be flipped. So there are even scaled operations that their dry room is also their cure room, because dry rooms, just as a rule, most of us keep it at what we call 60-60 and 14, right? So 60 degrees, 60% ambient relative humidity for 14 days. That's an okay condition to keep your flower curing in as well. Keeping it at cellar temperature, which depending on what part of the world you're in, but like mid 50s to low 60s is typical cellar, maybe a little bit lower. Keeping your flower in that state while you're curing in a contained space, do it. It's totally fine, but make sure you give yourself the space, because you can make it or break it with the quality of the flower that you ultimately are consuming based on what you're doing from the point of takedown. And again, that's what's going to be interesting. I was not a judge. I'm, again, more of an edibles than a flower judge, but I'm really interested to see which of these flowers wins, because if I only brought a measuring, we actually have tools, they're wood meters essentially, to probe and see what the moisture content is. I'm venturing to guess on the moisture content side, again, some of these are probably as low as 8-9%, but a lot of them are probably 11, 12, even 13% moisture content because of the environment we're in. So really curious to see who the winners are. Even the bud structure, that's one thing. Again, for those that grow, you have more typically denser buds, kind of heavier buds when they're indoor or mixed light. Outdoors, typically a little bit fluffier, a little bit larfier, which is what we need as outdoor growers. We need the ventilation so we don't get mold and powdery mildew from humidity and such. But really curious to see who the winners are, because that's, again, where a lot of these guys might have rushed it. They might have not had enough time to fully dry or enough time to cure. Some of them may have had too much time to dry and cure because this is from last season. So I'm interested to see who the top winners are and kind of be able to judge the flower more than just on the experiential, which, again, most do. For this competition, not, man, but there's a few. There's one, I was really a big fan. It was called the Grow Off, and we sponsored it for years. It was a group, actually, a guy who started is a guy who wrote for me at the Cannabist. They started it, and it was kind of a homogeneous. If you follow F1, is a good example, or a lot of people do now. I know it's trending, but like everyone starts off with the same motor, right? That was in that competition. Everyone gets the same clip in every market. So if you're in the California market, this is your RS25 cross runts or whatever it is, right? So everyone got the same clipping, but then how you grew it, so essentially what tires you ran, what suspension you ran, all those other elements in a race car, the same thing with this grow. How you grew it and everything else was up to you. But everyone started with the same plant, and to your point, they measured all those things along the way. And then some competitions do it, but most don't. They actually would get them tested. So they go and get COAs, right, as we call it. So the COAs would give you the percentage of the top cannabinoids, but also of the terpenes. So seeing how it expresses, and this is something also just to share, and I'll try not to geek out too much, but you have genotype, phenotype, chemotype, right? So genotype, and pick on Reggie because he's in the room. Geno's, Reggie's a great geneticist. And so like he's really looking at what these different profiles are of these different plants, and not just how he can optimize the terpenes he's looking for, the cannabinoids he's looking for, but the growing condition he's in. So there's a lot of growers that are already in that mindset. Some just, they get genetics they hear are great, and this is the most ideal way to grow them. So again, when you have a competition where you're starting all out with the same plant, but then you're able to see what those inputs are, because again, the genetics is only one aspect of it. The pheno, so you all have your own terroir appellations here, like we do in Northern California, like where you're what, like 3,000, 4,000? Okay, so he's at 2,000 feet where he's at. And he's literally right there. When we went out there, like the marine layer was right there. I mean, that layer of fog is made for a beautiful shot, the sun rays coming in through it. But he's in this really interesting space where he's constantly dancing with humidity. If he was more at sea level and further inland, he'd probably be protected from that. If he's even higher up, like 4,000, that's a whole other equation. But seeing what happens from the pheno side, so what outside things are influencing, the type of water, the type of oxygen, the type of moisture, the type of water he sources, like all those things contribute. So it'd be like all of us having the same plant. I now live in Southern California. So for me to grow something versus you growing something here, they would look completely different sitting next to each other on that table, just because of what environmental position we put them in when we're going through the growing process. The last is the chemotype. So again, the last crew got into a little bit of our endocannabinoid systems, but the chemo is how your body, your endocannabinoid system, interacts with that plant. Again, so whomever judged this, obviously everyone's input was subjective based on experience. I'm a Northern Lights guy, so I know if I came across anything that was even remotely reminiscent of NL, I'd probably be biased towards it. And again, someone like Nick or Mike, they might be more so into like the really, really loud, sharp hazes, or maybe they were more into like lemonine or pinene, right? So all those are opinions, but you bring the test into the equation, and it's like, okay, well now I know this is what this has, but for you rather chill and hang out and watch some TV. I'd rather go out and start mowing the lawn, It's all that chemotype as far as how our endocannabinoid systems interact with it. So I thought it was really cool in that last panel how they got into a little bit of that aspect of it, like what works for you. Because that's the problem, is there's a lot of this clout following, and again, I won't pick on, there's some brands that have definitely been leading the charge, but the hype strains are overrated because nobody's endocannabinoid system are exactly the same. So I say something's absolute fire, and then I give it to you, and you're like, oh my, I was seeing rainbows and butterflies for 4 hours, and I'd be like, really? It barely kicked in for me. We have very different bodies. We have very different endocannabinoid systems. So the one thing I think people should look at more so is how it was grown, where it was grown. Like that matters. You can't scale up cannabis like you can soybeans and corn. You just can't. I've seen it, and the best you get is mids, as we say, right? You're going to get, maybe it's going to be Molson versus Diet Coors or Bud Light, but you're not going to get to that level of like true craft if you go to excessive scale. It's just really hard to do, So, yeah. 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 Yeah.
And I realized I have to stagger my crop because when I harvest, I have to give enough time for each strain to dry completely, but enough.
Yeah.
To put it into a bin. If I bring every strain out, it'll absorb that moisture. It's like
Yeah.
a sponge.
Yep. Yeah.
And I have to run dehumidifier 24/7 and AC.
Yeah.
My electric bill's up. I do indoor because of the bugs, but
Yeah.
everything seems to work fine. It's a matter of just doing the right thing and checking your instrumentation.
Yeah.
Little
Yeah.
things can slip you up. So.
It's technology for the win. You make a good point. And I'm not against, and for those of us that grew up in NorCal, like we grew up with snapping sticks and squeezing buds. That's how you knew, excuse me, when you're ready to go from dry to cure, right? Which is pretty, like rubbing your sugar leaves the wrong way and having them just enough to break is usually like your 12 to 13% moisture count, like we know. But to your point, I agree with you. The example I use is, if I have a washing machine in the garage, why would I go down to the river and slap my clothes against the rocks to clean it? Like, that is and so it's so weird. I was just talking about this earlier. Americans, we're kind of set in our ways. We think we're the best. We think we know everything. So here, interesting enough, we're kind of closed-minded. It's like, oh, we've been doing this forever. My dad taught me, my grandfather. I mean, there's third-generation growers in Reggie's backyard. Like, it's crazy. There's guys that literally, they're hip necks that their parents came up there after the summer of love and never left, which is cool. But they passed down these things that, yeah, they worked year and year, but like now I'm like, why would you not use a moisture meter? Like, you can trust your snapping and squeezing all day, but the variance in your moisture content from this end of your dry room to that end of your dry room is exponential. I go in some of the biggest operations, and this trips me up. And again, I'm not trying to sell our own, but this is where we solve this problem. But a lot of growers, what they do is they still use turkey bags, especially West Coast, right? Because I want to see if it's keefing out or not. I want to see what's on the bottom. It's the best. You can see everything, right? So you take these turkey bags, and they put these turkey bags in black and yellows, as we call our HDX totes, right? So you're creating microclimates that are going within a microclimate that you're storing inside a macroclimate. So I'll tour facilities, and I'll bring in a moisture meter, even a couple Govies, wireless Govies, and I'll be like, we'll put one in that bag over in that tote. We'll put one in this bag over in this tote. And to your point, AC on this wall, DHU on this wall. Then we'll go and tour the facility for an hour or two. We'll come back. I'm like, let's see what the difference is. And the difference will be major point swing, right? You'll have 50% relative humidity in one bin and 63 in the other. I'm like, how do you expect to maintain the quality and consistency of your product if you're already creating a challenge with which the way you're storing them or curing them? Yeah, some people do that. Same. Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I was saying too. That's there right now, they call it the experiment. We call it the beta program. The Netherlands is going through an experiment, right? They started this over a year ago. And you have to have $10 million in order to get into it. So there's 10 operators, only 5 are online. But one of the biggest ones we're working with, they store all of their cured flour in our 5 kilo bags, our 10-pound bag, the big one out there. They store that in their dry room, and it's some of the best cured flour. But they're so smart and efficient. They're like, we've got this wall we're not using. Let's just put all these we don't need to control an environment. This entire environment's 60-60 all day, right? So they're like, we're just going to leverage what we already have. And they're doing it at scale. And then again, I come back to the US and I see some of these operations. I'm like, why are you guys trying to light a fire with sticks when you're in the middle of a restaurant that has click start flame broilers? Like I don't understand. Like, you've got all this other technology. You've got the fertigation system dialed in. You've got your packaging equipment over here. Why are you going archaic on this process, right? And pretty much you're increasing potential of loss or of quality, consistency, potency, but contamination. Again, don't open up the bag and agitate the buds and touch it and play it. Forget to put the top on stop. Try to be as efficient as possible. No matter, like, I'm like you, I'm a home grower. So I have to take a room, pump all my AC in it during the dry, and then flip that room to my cure, and then put it all when I'm aging it in my closet. Like, there's a lot of process. However you can streamline it, no matter yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, yeah.
Light's free in the sun, but the new light's coming out to produce more joules than the sun will put out, but it's at cost.
Yeah.
So, and I don't use the full because that's how I control heat flows, try and use less wattage. When I was in 1970, I grew cinnamon in California, up near Montrose.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Just below the snow line. It almost snowed there one year. But I would pull that stuff and boil the roots because I thought it helped steal. That was what we thought back then.
Yeah. Hey.
Boil the roots and hang it upside down. And then I had people following me with electronic surveillance on my car.
Oh, jeez.
And roommates, yeah, I found out too. But I would hang my stuff up in a tree in the backyard.
Yeah.
Because that's where it was hidden. No one would look at it.
There were guys growing in trees back. You remember, Rich? Yeah, yeah.
But the old Hawaiian bud was great,
Yeah.
Kona gold, and, a lot of
Yeah, they've been diluted. Yeah, I mean, even there's all of us have those land race. I got a Durban poison finally after years, a few years back. It is gorgeous. Yeah, but you'd have to search the world for it for sure, and definitely makes sense. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about storing cannabis in sealed canning jars? You know, the vacuum packed?
Yeah. So the atmospheric pressure isn't as much a factor as it is what you're starting off with. So there's some that do nitrogen or argon flushing. Those are both noble gases, obviously nitrogen being the most readily and cheapest, which they've had that same mentality of like, oh, let's avoid everything as far as oxygen. But one thing we saw with that, and there was I won't call them out in particular, but there was a company that made like a cat can solution that essentially they do a nitro flush. It'd be in this cat can, and it was like, I still have one, believe it or not, that's about 9 years old from the 14ers in Colorado. I'm still curious to open and see what happens. The problem that they found with nitro, at least with friends I know that use it, is while it does almost kind of suspend animation because you're all pulling the oxygen out of the environment, something weird happens where when it's reintroduced to an oxygen-rich environment, it speeds up, and all of a sudden it quickly does become oxidized and brown. So we have learned in many instances that what you're in the atmosphere, if you're avoiding it of all oxygen, okay, that's fine. If you're using some sort of, noble gas or some sort of inert gas, but if you're just pulling all of the vacuum out of there, we haven't noticed that big of a change. The one thing you are allowing, though, is the opportunity for, if there is anything, if you're talking about going into cure versus storage, the plant is still off-gassing. So that's a nice thing about it, is it's off-gassing, creating an ideal environment. And again, candidly, for our technology, I think I was telling this with you or someone else, like we do comparisons. Like you saw, we stainless steel, turkey bags, totes, you name it, with a humidity pack, without a humidity pack. The only thing that even comes close to us, believe it or not, is a jar, but not burping it. That's the crazy part, is because if you keep allowing the oxygen in and allow that atmosphere to change, then you're going to have an issue. But yeah, I would, if not using our technology, I would be sticking with jars. There's a reason why we used all those years versus turkey bags or totes or stainless. Yeah. Yeah, even Canatrol. Like a lot of people are using Canatrols. I was just on a panel with Ed over there. And so for those that don't know, Canatrol is like this, it looks like a college fridge that creates the ideal environment for drying and curing. But we're partnering with them because, people are like, well, I still need to store it. Like, and I want to store it somewhere that creates a perfect environment. Yeah. So definitely something. 100%. Yeah. Yeah, you got to keep it cool. That's a bit, even with our everyone's like, oh, does it manage or help, manage that perfect, temperature? No, you still need to do that. Yeah. No, I'm not a fan. So kind of a misnomer. So a lot of people don't realize this, but both refrigerators and freezers actually pull moisture out of an environment. So a lot of people are like, oh, but it's cool, it's cold. We associate cold with higher moisture percentage, but it actually wicks it out. So that's when you see, say you take some bread that's getting kind of old and you're like, not even the fridge, I'm going to go straight to the freezer. And then you see the crystals start building up and that frostbite, and that's where frostbite comes from, is the biomass or the materials that you have inside that container. The moisture is being wicked out by that ambient environment, but not quick enough to dissipate before it gets to a level of cool to where it crystallizes. So like even for us, for people that we work with that are freezing or putting their biomass in a colder space, they're typically squeezing it late. Squeezing is what we say. So they're typically turning it into fresh frozen or some sort of concentrate. The old days of putting it in the freezer to keep it fresh, what happens is the trichomes, that's where all the magic is, right? On these, those what makes it sticky. So the terpenes are in the trichomes. You have cannabinoids that are there. So they become brittle and break off. So that's a challenge, is if you're trying to be back to an ideal temperature to consume, especially by ignition, rather be convectional or non, dry or vaporizing or rolling up a joint, then you're going to run into a little bit of an issue. If you're going to be making butter out of it, like trim or something, yeah, throw it in the freezer, whatever. It's not so much a factor because you're essentially going to be stripping everything off that biomass anyway. So, but yeah, I'd refrain from fridge or freezer. But the coolest space you have, usually it's a closet in the middle of it. For me, it is a closet in the middle of my house. Is so dark and shaded. It's like the mid 60s year round. So even that's more ideal than just out on top of the fridge or somewhere. So, yeah, dark cool and not in the freezer. Again, if you are going to do fresh frozen later, you're going to squeeze it, that's totally fine. But yeah, in the freezer, because what happens is, how do you properly thaw that out in what condition are ultimately those trichomes going to be in. So if you take a magnifying glass or a loop, a lot of us travel at loops, and see what's going on those buds prior to being frozen and after being frozen, you'll see what I mean. It's just not the most ideal way to store it. If you have somewhere cool, dry, dark, that's the way to go for storage, for long-term storage especially. Root cellar, I think it'd be like, not to be old school, but like root cellars, they're definitely a way to go. Any other questions? We kind of blast through. How are we doing? Good on time. Cool, awesome. Well, definitely thank you all for coming in and listening. I appreciate it.